Well, it's my pleasure to be here. We love Stephen and Katie. They've been friends for many years, and just grateful to be here. I want to start, I've got some slides I'm going to put up on the screen, but I want to start with a Bible verse. It's one that you should add to your memory list if you don't already know it. But in John 14:6, Jesus said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Things that I didn't think we would have to review in church are becoming things that we have to make sure as a church, like, hey guys, some churches are confused on this. Let's make sure we're not one of them. The second sentence is a claim of exclusivity. Jesus is the only way to the Father, okay? I don't understand how there are Christians like, oh, I think there's many roads. It's not what Jesus said, right? He is the only way to the Father, but I want to highlight, he says he's the way and the truth. This becomes even more significant in our culture when we have a culture that is pretending like they don't know if truth even exists anymore, right? And understand, the attack on truth is not an attack on science. It's not an attack on biology or medicine. No, it's literally the fundamental attack. Go back to Genesis, the very beginning. The first question of the devil was an attack on truth. Did God really say that this has always been the way the devil operates? Why? Why does the devil care about truth? Because what did Jesus tell the disciples, John 8:32? Jesus said that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Why does the devil care about truth? Because he knows what it produces. And he doesn't want you to walk in freedom. Right? I mean, this is the bottom line. Now, what we do at Wall Builders, we spend way more time focusing on American history, but this is also a big deal because the lies that we are seeing in culture aren't just things that pertain maybe to the obvious ones of gender, right? The obvious, like, you know, can boys play in girls' sports? Like, things, again, like, I can't believe we're having to have these conversations as grown adults in culture, and yet we are. But it's similar if we look at history and why this matters. There was a book written back in the 1950s, and the guy that wrote it, it was a dystopian novel, and it's become one of the most prophetically accurate books of culture today. It was 1984 by George Orwell. If you've never read it and then be boggled at how accurate it is of what he said crazy governments would do, and like, that's what we do. Nonetheless, one of the things he wrote in his book, he said, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Now, let me break it down real quick because the idea, whoever controls the present controls the past. The people that are in charge of educational institutions, right, whether it's professors, curriculum writers, whoever it is, they are controlling the narrative about what people are thinking about America. And if you are being taught to think that America is a uniquely evil nation, and therefore, we need to do away with all these things. Well, if this is what you are growing up thinking, then what's going to happen? Well, what he says, whoever controls the past controls the future. If you're controlling that narrative and America is evil, then what do we need to do? Well, let's get rid of America, right? If the Constitution's evil, or I mean, just you can walk through this progression. This is what's happening right now, that the rising generation is hearing, now wait a second, so America was built because of slavery, and everything in America is evil because it was all slavery and white supremacists, and like the whole thing goes down. Why does that matter? Well, it actually goes back to a Marxist ideology. And you actually can go back to 1980. There was a guy named Howard Zinn who wrote a People's History of the United States. And Howard Zinn said everybody that you think is a good person historically actually was really evil. And he starts with Christopher Columbus, goes through, and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and everybody that you think we should honor in America. People have said we should honor them. He said, nope, they're really, really terrible people. This was a carryout, again, back to a Marxist ideology. In Marxism, there's only two categories of people. You're either oppressed or you're the oppressor, right? Like, that's all there is. And so, if you are the oppressor, then the most moral thing that somebody can do is try to overthrow and stop the oppressor. And if you've been oppressed, then you should do anything you can to disrupt the system. This is what's being promoted literally in public schools all over the nation and universities all over the nation. And it goes back to the movement in education was known as deconstructionism. And the idea was you just want to tear down whatever's there so you can build something back in its place. And a lot of the criticisms and the tearing down comes, and people, what's boggling as someone that studies history, people don't even know the story, right? And they're like, but it's evil. And I'm like, you don't even know what happened. They're like, but we know it was evil. You don't even know what happened, right? And this is, for us, as we're trying to navigate this, and we're pointing back, like if you go back to the Founding Fathers, right? And people are like, they were so evil. The disconnect in modern culture, because people know names, they think they know the story, right? Well, I've heard of George Washington. Cool. Tell me 3 stories you know about George Washington. He chopped down a cherry tree. No, he didn't. That was a lie. Like, literally, the most popular story wasn't even a true story, but that's the only one most people know. Well, the name is famous, so we think we know them. And the reality is we know way less about the story than we think. In fact, as we get close to the 4th of July, one of the things that when I was growing up back in the 80s and 90s, in the evening when I got to stay up late as a kid, it was really fun. My parents would at times have on Jay Leno, and he would do jaywalking, right? He'd go on the street, he would interview people, and then if you have watched in modern culture, you have guys like Will Witt, who used to be on Prager University, Jesse Waters from Waters World. They would do man-on-the-street interviews, and you watch these people, and you're like, it's so embarrassing, the things they don't know. And internally, if you really think about it and you're honest, you're like, but please don't ask me any of those questions, right? Like, I don't want to have to answer it. Every 4th of July, there's people that do man-on-the-street interviews, and it's always humorous and sad at the same time. But one of the reasons that we will find less and less people knowing the story is because the narrative that is being told in the schools today, we're not even telling the story anymore. In fact, in a lot of schools, and actually a huge percentage of public schools, they're actually moving in their curriculum to not even talk about like the Declaration of Independence anymore. And I'll come to that more in a second. But the reason, again, this matters. If we back up and understand that the story is there, and I will hopefully show some connections of why even this matters, you just need to know, if you're a parent and a grandparent, there will come a time, and you can even ask your family about it this summer and say, hey, so what do we celebrate on the 4th of July? You just ask some basic questions, and it might be shocking what people don't know, but you also should be aware that at some point, you're going to probably have to teach your kids, your grandkids, what they're not learning, what they should be learning. And so if we go back, right, basic questions like, who do we separate from? Well, it was King George III. Really, it was England, right? Why? Because the king was like, hey, you American colonists, we do not recognize you as normal colonists. He suspended the British Bill of Rights. He said, you have no rights. He said, you have to do whatever I tell you, and you don't. Like, there's a whole big deal. It's actually the reason they wrote the Declaration of Independence. And as I mentioned, this is something that in many public schools, they're removing from the curriculum. Now, I'll get to why in a second, but this is actually kind of a big deal, because if you're trying to explain this, how do you explain this to your kids and grandkids? Let me give you what I think is the easiest explanation of the Declaration of Independence. This was the greatest breakup letter ever written, where they were like, okay, so it's not really working out anymore, and to be clear, like, it's not us, it's all you, and here are all your problems. Right? Like, this is the greatest thing ever. This is what the Declaration of Independence is. And if you go back and look at the Declaration was done by Thomas Jefferson, who was 33 years old at that time. And if you can remember as a kid, I remember as a kid, when my parents were in their 30s, and I remember even my dad's 40th birthday because they put 40 candles, and they made jokes and brought a fire extinguisher out. Like, you remember as a kid, these moments. And I remember being like, they're so old. Right? I mean, genuinely, as a kid, right? And you're like, people in their 30s are so old. And then you grow up a little bit, and you get in your 30s, and you're like, it's not that old, right? Like, we're still cool. We still fit in, right? But what we discover is that you are not inherently brilliant as a 33-year-old. So for Thomas Jefferson to be able to articulate the political philosophy of the nation in one of the most profound ways ever is quite remarkable. And if you remember the Declaration, for those of us that still learn the Declaration in education, if you go back to the second paragraph, the most famous part of the Declaration, where he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. In those words, Jefferson lays out the philosophy of government, and notice how he starts. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, a couple of really important things about this. The Founding Fathers disagreed all the time. They argued all the time. But in the midst of their disagreements, they said, okay, there's some common ground that we disagree about a lot, but here's what we agree on. These are the fundamental truths that all of us acknowledge, like these things are real. I want you to think about this in our culture. What are the truths that we can unite around in our culture when half the culture pretends like boys and girls aren't even real things? understand the challenge of what we are navigating as we are not even really being able to defend and recognize truth in so much of modern culture. Well, for them, they said, okay, no, there's some truths that we still believe, and actually, they said these truths are self-evident, meaning obvious. Like, if you pay attention, this should be obvious. Well, what were the obvious truths? That we were created equal, that we were endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, and that government exists to secure our God-given rights. My dad and I were in Louisiana just a year or two ago testifying in a House committee on the importance of original documents, because there was a state rep who was trying to pass a piece of legislation that was going to require public schools to have students to have to read the Declaration, Constitution, Bill of Rights, to have to memorize portions like we used to do, right? Memorize a portion of the Declaration, memorize a portion of the Constitution, memorize at least the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. And so we went to testify in a committee as experts on historical original documents, and we finish our testimony, we go and sit down, and then the committee begins to debate. And they determined in the committee, now Louisiana, right? A little weird, we get. That joke works in 49 states. In Louisiana, in their committee, they determined that this was not appropriate for kids to memorize because of the racist content in the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Right. There are moments when you have to sit by and watch things happen and you're like, oh, somebody please ask me a question, right? Can I help? I would like to tell you the answer right now. And we had to sit there and watch. And the levels of dumb in the conversation kept growing. And we're like, this is painful. And they're saying, well, this is so racist. If you look at this, what is the racist part? And they said, well, when it says we're created equal, that's racist. That's a racist statement. That is the opposite of a racist statement. But the argument was, well, but the founding fathers, all of them owned slaves, which they did not. And when they argued for being created equal, it was only for white people, not for black people, because they had slaves. Therefore, this is racist, and no student should have to memorize something so racist. Now, let me unfold a deeper thought for you. The reason it matters, not just that we know the American story, but that we become pursuers of truth and are not misled. If you go to the book of Acts in the Bible, the Apostle Paul, he goes all over the place sharing the good news of Jesus. And keep in mind, there is no New Testament yet. Because the New Testament, right, is a story of what the guys in the New Testament did, right? The Apostle Paul writes 13 epistles, they're in the Bible, but those aren't part of the actual Bible yet as they're out witnessing and doing things. Well, the Apostle Paul goes to Berea. And in Acts, we learn about the Bereans. And the Bereans were the people that, as the Apostle Paul is sharing, they didn't believe anything he said until they had looked it up. And Paul actually praises them. He's like, you guys are amazing. Because no one's ever going to mislead you because they were pursuers of truth. And if you think through the story, I mean, logically, probably what he was doing, he's trying to share Jesus with them. And so probably he's like, guys, we know Isaiah prophesied about this, because there's a lot of prophecies in Isaiah about Jesus. So he's probably like, guys, Isaiah told us this. And they're like, wait a second. We don't trust this guy. Somebody get the scroll of Isaiah. And they did, and they opened, they're like, oh, Isaiah did say that. Okay, you may continue. And he's like, okay, well, we know Joel prophesied. And they're like, wait, somebody get the scroll of Joel. And this is how their Bible study goes, right? And Paul's like, you guys are incredible. No one is going to mislead you because they were pursuers of truth. In our modern culture, we have become so comfortable with an expert giving us the information. It got so bold a couple of years ago, we were told we weren't allowed to question the experts. You can't question the science. I think that's how science works, right? You ask questions and I'm pretty sure this is science. But this is where I want to encourage you. We have to go beyond what does somebody say, and we have to go, well, what's true? And if we are going to be pursuers of truth, I'm setting this up because I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you something, and I'm going to tell you, please don't trust me on this. Okay? Go look it up. And I say this with a lot of confidence because truth is not insecure. Truth does not mind being fact-checked. Because we know what you're going to find if you fact-check it. It is only people that are lying that want to prevent the honest presentation of truth because they don't want to be exposed. So they say, don't question the science. Then I already know where you're coming from, right? Let me point out, in this committee in Louisiana, where we're saying, hey, we should have kids study original documents, and they're like, no, it's racist. And I'm like, this is why you should study original documents, because if you actually went back to the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, it's 4 pages long. You can actually get online and you can see high-res images. You can read this all. We at Wall Builders have a very large collection. We have the first printing of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Okay? So, like, just an amazing artifact that we have, this amazing document. There's 4 pages, as you see on the screen. The first page is where Jefferson lays out the political philosophy. It is in the second paragraph where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. The second page, he goes through and he's listing grievances. The third page, he's listing grievances. And the fourth page, he wraps up the political philosophy. In the original draft, there were 24 grievances. The longest grievance in the original draft was the 24th grievance, and it was nearly half of the third page. Now, what is significant about the largest grievance in the original draft of the Declaration is the grievance was against the slave trade, against slavery, and arguing for the humanity of those that were enslaved. Now, again, the reason this matters, Louisiana, they're like, it's racist. It's literally the opposite is what they were trying to accomplish. Now, I'm going to read this for you. If you get online, you can enlarge this. If you can read cursive, it says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself. I don't mean that slighting. This is not an Arkansas joke. Right? This is not the joke that works in 49 other states against your expense, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it because in schools, they removed cursive, right? A couple decades ago, it is kind of coming back, but, right, this is not the Arkansas joke. I will have those when I leave. But I'm going to put the text up. Again, don't take my word for this, but this is what was written by Thomas Jefferson. He says, he has waged cruel war, and he is the king. The king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Now let's pause. That's clearly talking about the slave trade, right? One continent on a boat to be sold, or they die in the process. It picks up. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers. Let me pause again. What is piratical warfare? That's pirates. Okay? Well, he says this piratical warfare, so the pirates, the opprobrium of infidel powers, infidel is non-believer. Who were the non-Christian pirates? They were the Barbary pirates from North Africa. They were the Muslim nations of North Africa, who are the ones who began the exportation of Africans in the African slave trade. Okay? So Jefferson saying that this piratical warfare of the Muslims in North Africa is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Now, in the original draft, the word infidel and Christian are both underlined. But the word Christian is the first word that is printed not in cursive. Why? He's drawing your attention to it. Right? This would be like the air quotes. This Christian king, like the guy says he's a Christian, he's doing what the Muslim pirates are doing. This Christian king of Great Britain determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. And the word men was printed and fully capitalized. Why does it matter? Because Jefferson wrote in the second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He actually clarified who men were, and he included the enslaved individuals coming out of Africa. Now again, this is incredibly significant. Now, to go a little further, the next line, he says, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt. What does it mean to suppress a legislative attempt? Well, this is the equivalent of if the state legislature passes something and the governor's like, I don't like that, the governor vetoes it. That is what it means to suppress a legislative attempt. The king, in 1773, there were 4 colonies, and this is just one example. There were 4 colonies that passed laws against the slave trade. In 1774, the king vetoed all of those laws. He said, you're British colonies. The slave trade is part of what the British Empire does. You can't end the slave trade in your colonies. Pennsylvania was one of those states that had done that. This led Benjamin Franklin to say, this is one more reason we should separate from the king. He won't even let us end the slave trade in our own colonies. Now, this is stuff that, again, this is very well documented historically. It's not talked about, but this is part of the original draft. And people look at the founding fathers. And let me stay with Benjamin Franklin for a second. Because if you study the founding fathers. The leading accusation today was all the founding fathers are racist and they're these bigoted slaveholders. And if I ask people, right, like, well, what founding fathers do you know that had slaves? Most people can name like Jefferson and George Washington, and they've run out, right? Like, that's all they got. There were more than 200 founding fathers, okay? And you know two that had slaves, and you think you have like the whole picture because you know two people, and you don't even really know the whole story of those two people. I don't have time to get into that right now, but the reality is there were 56 signers of the Declaration. Only 41 of them at any point in their life ever owned slaves. But of the 41, the question nobody seems to ask or investigate, of those 41, how many of them came out against the slave trade, against slavery, freed their own slaves, started or funded abolition societies, and worked to end slavery in the nation? Because it was the majority. This is where, let me back you up. 1773, Pennsylvania is one of those 4 states that passed one of these anti-slave trade laws. Benjamin Franklin writes a letter to the Reverend Dean Woodward. And all of these letters you can look up and find online, okay? But this is to the Reverend Dean Woodward, and here's what Franklin tells him about the anti-slavery position, the sentiment growing in America. He says, a disposition to abolish slavery prevails in North America, that many of Pennsylvanians have set their slaves at liberty, and that even the Virginia Assembly have petitioned the king for permission to make a law for preventing the importation of more of that colony. So just to make sure we're tracking, Franklin says, in Pennsylvania, we're already setting our slaves free. In Virginia, they've just passed another law trying to end the slave trade. That's the importation of slaves, right? Trying to end the slave trade so they don't get any more slaves in Virginia. They're trying to slow this thing down. The next line he says, this request, however, will probably not be granted as their former laws of that kind have always been repealed. If there's former laws, it means this was not the first time they tried it. If they've always been repealed, it means the king has always struck this down. Now, again, a couple of really important things about this. Franklin's saying, hey, in Pennsylvania, this is before the Declaration, like it's before independence happens in America. He says, we're already seeing, like, this is really wrong. We've got to stop this. And it's why, if you look at the founding fathers, and Benjamin Franklin, again, is an easy example. If you look at Benjamin Franklin, Franklin is one of the founding fathers that no historian considers him a racist, even though he had slaves. Well, how does he skip that? Because he's one of the founding fathers, very clearly historically, that long before the American Revolution, long before the Declaration, he's one of those in Pennsylvania that freed his slaves. He then goes on, after he signs the Declaration, 11 years later, he's back in Independence Hall in the same room when they're doing the Constitution. He's the oldest man at the Constitutional Convention. At the time he is there at the Constitutional Convention, he's actually the president of Pennsylvania's Abolition Society, working to end slavery, not just in Pennsylvania, because they've already done that, but end slavery in all the other colonies. He went from owning slaves, freeing his slaves independently, right? And then working for funding and becoming the president of the very first anti-slavery society in America. It was founded in 1774. This is the full circle, right? And again, the irony of this, when even I'm thinking through this, I was in Louisiana State Legislature and they're like, oh no, we can't have kids memorize original documents because blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is like, your argument is making my point, right? If we actually knew history, we would recognize when they do the Declaration, when the founding fathers are there and they're saying, we believe that all men are created equal, they actually did believe that. And this is why when they said these truths are self-evident, this was something that was so obvious to them, they were ready to break away and start a brand new nation where this was going to be really clear in their brand new nation. Now, the reason that grievance in the original draft, as I mentioned, there were 24 grievances. This is the last of the 24. This 24th is the largest grievance. The reason it didn't appear in the final draft of the Declaration, John Hancock was the president of Congress. He said they would only include in the final draft would have been unanimously agreed to. He said, because if we put things in there that we don't all agree to, the king might be able to come in and pull us apart by our own local separate interests. So it has to be unanimous. Whatever we put in is unanimous. And Jefferson wrote that there were 2 colonies that opposed that grievance, Georgia and South Carolina, because they said, well, up to this point, we haven't tried to end the slave trade. We haven't really come out against slavery, and we don't think that's really a problem. We don't have that problem with the king, so we think it should stay in. And Jefferson lamented in his journal how sad it was that there weren't more abolitionists that could have convinced these guys to come against it, because they could have ended that right there. But it's also worth noting that 11 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of it. But because it was unanimous, it didn't last. Now, let me back you up. All of these truths, they were in the original draft. They made it to the final draft. This is part of the Declaration. And when the founding fathers said these truths are self-evident, I want you to think about it for a second. Is it obvious that we're created equal? Well, it should be. Is it obvious that we have God-given rights? I would hope we could agree with that. Is it obvious that government should protect our rights? Again, I would hope so. But let me point out, those are not universally obvious. You understand, if you go around the world, if you go to India, do you know in India, there is still largely a class system in India? They actually still, the majority of the population in India believes in reincarnation, and you reincarnate to a different class based on how you lived your last life. That's a belief system. If you go to any major Muslim nation, the Middle East or Africa, they don't believe in equality between men and women, much less between Islam and some other faith. The idea we're created equal, that's not a universally obvious idea. The idea that we have God-given rights, most of the members of Congress, I'm not sure that they know that we have God-given rights in our own nation. But do you think in China they believe in God-given rights? In North Korea? Let's be honest. In most of the world, they don't believe in this. And if we're going to be really honest, the reason we separated from the king is because he didn't believe in those either. So why would they say these truths are obvious? These truths are only obvious to people who know what the Bible says. Because where do we get the idea that we're created equal? Well, that's Genesis 1, 26 and 27, that God made them in his image, male and female, he created them. And you know what's interesting about Genesis? It never tells us what shape, size, or color Adam and Eve were. Why? Because it doesn't matter, right? We live in a culture, it's like, nope, what group you're a part of, that's the most important. Not in God's economy, right? In God's economy, we are all kids made in his image. Right? Like that is where the value comes from. Well, this is where they got the idea we're created equal. The idea that we have God-given rights start in the Garden of Eden. Did God give Adam and Eve the freedom of speech? Right? The freedom of religious choice? Because he said, all the fruit, any tree you want. Like there's one you shouldn't, but he let them choose. God gave rights way before government ever existed. And this is important because if our rights came from God, not government, then government's not the one that's supposed to determine what rights we do and don't get. Right? Some pandemic hits and they're like, you don't have the right to go to church anymore. And we're like, well, it's a good thing my rights don't come from you. Right? I think there's a lot of people who are coming to that realization, but let me just tell you, it took a reality check of COVID for most people to start questioning who's really in charge, right? Like, who am I really serving? Where do my rights really come from? Well, again, the idea that our rights come from God starts in the Garden of Eden and goes forward. And even the idea that government exists to protect our rights, the very first civil ordinance God ever gave to man was recorded in Genesis chapter 9. It's when the ark lands on Mount Ararat, Noah gets off, and God tells Noah, if man sheds blood, by man his blood will be shed. Meaning, if there's a murderer coming and doing that kind of evil, that society, y'all need to get together and we're going to remove that member of society from society because the purpose of government is to protect your God-given right, the first of which being your right to life. So if someone takes that, they're forfeiting that position. Now, whether you feel good about that or not, I'm just telling you, this is where that comes from, right? Like this is where that started. And as you walk through this process, even going back to like the Declaration, the idea that the Declaration was influenced by the Bible is something that a lot of people in modern culture have a hard time reconciling, but it's really because we don't know the story of history very well. There's a lot of previous historians, like Clinton Rossiter was a professor at Cornell University. He wrote a book called The Seed Time of the Republic, and in his book he documented there were 6 main thought leaders that came up with a majority of the ideas that led to American independence. And as he breaks down those 6 individuals, he said Benjamin Franklin, Richard Bland, the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the Reverend Roger Williams, the Reverend John Wise, and the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. Those are the 6 people that came up with the most significant ideas that led America to independence. 4 of those are pastors, right? Now, how in the world are pastors the ones influencing the founding fathers? Well, let me just give you a super easy example. If you take the Reverend John Wise, he was a pastor from Ipswich, Massachusetts, in the late 1600s through the early 1700s. And 1717 was his last book of sermons that came out. And in his last book of sermons, he actually had a couple of significant sermons in there. And in those sermons, he actually preached that taxation without representation was tyranny. He preached that God's preferred form of government was the consent of the governed. And he preached that all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights given to them by their Creator. If you have read the Declaration of Independence, those phrases should sound familiar. Okay? all of those appear verbatim in the Declaration. Well, these were sermons from 1717. How did they impact the founding fathers of the Declaration? Because those sermons were actually reprinted in 1772. They were reprinted by the Sons of Liberty, who started in Massachusetts. And as they start the movement in Massachusetts, one of the conversations they have is, how do we get people to understand where we're coming from, what we're thinking, what we're doing? And one of the guys says, I've got these sermons from this pastor, and I think it explains so well what we're dealing with, and we should have those sermons redone and distributed, and they do. And those sermons went to all 13 colonies, and when the Founding Fathers get together in 1776, those sermons appear verbatim in the Declaration. And what's interesting, too, is that the Founding Fathers whose libraries survived, every one of them had a copy of John Weiss's sermons. So we know that every founding father not only had these, if they had them, they would have read them. When they get together, they know what these sermons are. And to go even a little further on this, historians used to identify this. B.F. Morris was a very noted historian from the 1800s. He explained some of the most glittering sentences in the immortal Declaration of Independence are almost literal quotations from this essay of John Weiss. It was used as a political textbook in the great struggle for freedom. Now, all I'm wanting to point out is that early historians used to acknowledge, where did these ideas primarily come from? Even Calvin Coolidge, I think he's one of the most underrated presidents in American history, but on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration, he went back to Independence Hall, which is where the Declaration was originally written, and he gave a speech on the anniversary on the 4th of July. You actually can get online and read his speech. It's a really good speech. But part of the speech, one of the things he explained is the thoughts in the Declaration can very largely be traced back to what John Weiss was writing. Here was the doctrine of equality of popular sovereignty and inalienable rights asserted by Weiss. So where did these ideas come from? It used to be obvious. Well, it was that really significant pastor, right? It was his sermons that influenced these guys, and this is just one of the examples, right? I could go through lots of examples. This is one that's super easy and obvious, but this is the point, is that earlier generations used to know that the founding fathers were influenced by the Bible. And today, if you look at a guy like Sam Adams, easy example, he was one of the Sons of Liberty in 1772 who reprinted those sermons. Well, he was also known as the father of the American Revolution. Now, if you ask most people today what they know about Sam Adams, the only thing they seem to know about Sam Adams, right, is he's the beer guy, which is really sad for his legacy, because he was way more than that, right? But the reality is, as one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, right? So from the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, all this is where the Sons of Liberty were. He's one of the leaders, but one of the things they came up with is the Committees of Correspondence. And in 1772, one of their ideas was, if we're going to get all of the colonies to work together, we have to make sure we're all thinking through this the same way. So they came up with the idea of sending a letter. They call them circulars, but they said, let's write letters and let's circulate them through all the colonies to make sure everybody's seeing and reading and thinking the same way together. He wrote the very first one. You actually can look it up online, Sam Adams Committee of Correspondence, and in 1772, it had 3 sections. So it was not quite 3 pages, but almost. But the first section was the rights of the colonists as men. Second section was the rights of the colonists as Christians, and the third section was the rights of the colonists as British subjects. I want to focus on the second section where he wrote on the rights of the colonists as Christians. Here is the opening line of that section. And remember, the idea, the reason he wrote this letter, it goes to all 13 colonies. They're trying to get everybody to understand and think the same. Here's how that section starts. The rights of the colonists as Christians may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which will be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament. His opening line is, guys, if you want to understand what we're thinking, you should read your Bibles, really study the life of Jesus, because that's impacting the way we're thinking. This is where he's coming from. Now, again, the idea, going back to the founding fathers thinking, wait a second, the founding fathers being influenced by the Bible, that is not what most history books say today. But the reason we don't know that, again, is because we know names and not stories. If you go back to guys like, for example, John Adams. John Adams, one of the most noted founding fathers, right, signs the Declaration, very involved over in Europe in the whole process of becoming free. When George Washington becomes president, he's the first vice president that goes on to be the second president. Really important guy, American historical. In his writings, he actually talked about the impact of the Bible on his life, on the other founders, and one of the things he wrote about it, he said, I've examined all religions and the result is that the Bible is the best book in the world. Now, let me give another thought. Most Christians don't even know what the Bible says, much less do they know why it's the best, and they absolutely have not spent time studying all the other religions. The reason the Bible is the best is because of all the other religions, right? Like, there's nothing like the Bible. There's nothing as reliable. There's nothing as confirmed. I mean, genuinely, he says, I've examined them all. I've read everything there is to read, and there's nothing like the Bible. Well, then he goes on, and he says, suppose a nation in some distant region should take the Bible for their only law book, and every member should regulate its conduct by the precepts there exhibited. So imagine if there was a place and all they did was do what the Bible said, right? What would that place look like? He concluded, what a utopia, what a paradise would this region be? Yeah, I mean, imagine how good Chicago would be if they would just follow the Ten Commandments, right? Like, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. Like, we could make this place so much better. This was his thought about the Bible. Well, his son, John Quincy Adams, goes on to become the 6th president, but John Quincy Adams talked about growing up in the founding era, and he said as a kid growing up, he explained, it's not so much, or with regard to his recounting of the Bible, it's not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it. It's not impressive to know the Bible, it's embarrassing not to know the Bible. And let me give you a reality check. Many of us feel like we're pretty well-educated people. The number one literary work ever written in the history of the world is the Bible. Nothing's been translated more, sold more, printed more, copied more. Nothing compares to the Bible, and yet, how many educated people do we know that are super ignorant of the Bible? Your education might not be as good as you thought. We can go even further, right? The reality is that most Christians have not read the Bible cover to cover, right? And I want to say this with grace, but also I'm very happy to step on your toes for a minute. If you've been saved for more than 3 or 4 years, if you've never read the book you say you base your life on, like, I feel like that's embarrassing, right? Like, okay, so in fairness, I've never read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but I hear they're really good books. I'm going to base my life on it. I've never read them, but I like the movies. That's weird, right? Like, well, I've seen some movies about Jesus, and I think he's a great guy, so I'm going that. No, there's an actual book, and you should read it, and you should go through it. And this is where there's a disconnect in our culture, but he says, no, in their culture, it wasn't impressive for people to know the Bible. It was embarrassing when they didn't. Why? Because that was a reflection of their culture. Because in their culture, this is what we're all going to know. In fact, if to give you a more modern, practical thought on this, if we ask any educated adult what's 2 plus 2, it's not impressive for them to know 2 plus 2 is 4. It's embarrassing if they don't know it. Right. It's embarrassing for you not to know what should be obvious. Right? It's not impressive that you know what's obvious. It's embarrassing not to know, well, this is the way they viewed the Bible. Now, where does he get this idea? Let me take you back, right? As he grows up under John and Abigail, right, this is the values he is learning from them. And if you're not familiar with them, these guys are amazing, right? Ideal early American couple, super fun. They wrote more than 1,100 letters back and forth from the Revolution to the end of their life. And there's actually books that just have their letters in them. If you are a Hallmark movie person, you should read their letters. You would love them, okay? If you're not, then you will be overwhelmed, right? There are letters where John Adams is like, Abigail, I'm suffocating because I haven't seen you in almost a week, and you're the air that I breathe, right? And I'm on some level, I'm like, that's a good one, write that down, right? But, like, this is their letters, okay? So very, very much the Hallmark thought. Well, during the Revolution, John Adams is one of the top, if not the top ambassador America has. So he and Benjamin Franklin, top 2 ambassadors, they're gone like the whole revolution over in Europe, trying to negotiate, get us allies, trying to find us peace with Great Britain. And so while he's gone, Abigail is like single momming it, right? I mean, there's times she's by herself for 6 months, 8 months, more than a year by herself. And this is just the way it was in the Revolution. So she's running the family. She's taking care of the farm and the business. She's doing it all and in remarkable fashion. Well, the church where they attended is still in existence today in Massachusetts, in Quincy, Massachusetts. And actually outside the church, there is a statue of Abigail and John Quincy Adams, because what was so well known is they were so faithful in church, no matter what, they were always going to be there. And I do think it's a little sad and ironic. Like, John's not in the statue, right? Because he was not there. He was in Europe the whole time, but they were always going to be in church. Well, this is the way John Quincy Adams grows up. In fact, as he's growing up, this is a painting that was done. You see his wig, and I really like showing this one because it proves that everybody had bad yearbook photos, right? Like this is, there it is. There's your wig. That's great, bro. As he's growing up, the revolution happens in front of him. When the shot around the world happens, 6 weeks later, there's a battle of Bunker Hill. He and his mom were in town when that battle happened. They went out on an adjacent hill, and they watched the battle unfold before them. Their family friend, Dr. Joseph Warren, he was wounded in the battle, and at the end of the battle, he's on the ground, and the British were angry. They didn't want any prisoners, so they took their bayonets and they killed everybody. John Quincy Adams was 6 years old, and he watched his family doctor be stabbed to death. That's going to grow you up kind of quick, right? When he was 8 years old, the Massachusetts Minutemen were practicing their musket drills in front of John Adams' home, and John Adams gives his 8-year-old son a musket and says, you need to go train with the Massachusetts Minutemen because there's no telling when you're going to have to know how to do this. Again, like, that's going to grow you up pretty quick. This is the way he grows up. When he was 10 years old, he went with his dad on a diplomatic mission over to Paris. And while he was in Paris, there's a really fun letter from his mom where she writes him, and she's like, okay, I don't even know if you're still alive because I haven't gotten a letter from you, and I'm not angry, but you should have written me. But I just want to remind you of a few things you need to know, okay? Well, as she goes on in this letter, she explains that over in France, they have a different value system than we do. So you have to remember the training that you had, the values that are instilled in you, and this is part of what she writes in the letter. She says, adhere to those religious sentiments and principles which were early instilled into your mind, and remember, you are accountable to your Maker for all your words and actions, right? And I love this because she's like, okay, I'm not there, but Jesus is watching you. You just, right? You're still responsible. Well, she goes on and it gets even better. She says, dear as you are to me, I'd much rather you should find your grave in the ocean, or an untimely death crop you in your infant years, rather than see you an immoral, wicked, or graceless child. I hope you drown in the ocean, love, Mom. Okay, right? But think through this for a second. Proverbs 22:6 tells us, train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he won't depart from it. What is she doing? She's instilling an eternal perspective. Son, it would be better for you to die early, connected to Christ, than live a long life rejecting faith, doing your own thing. Like, I mean, just amazing. Well, this is the way he grows up, right? When he was 11, he received an actual congressional commission to be the official secretary to America's top diplomat over to Paris, which was his father, right? So you could look and be like, that feels a little nepotistic, right? Like, you know, you're giving your son special permission. Well, I also could point out that most kids finish school between 11 and 13 years old in that era, right? So for him to be 11, it's not normal modern era kind of educational thought. And to further make this point, when he was 14, he received a second congressional appointment. This time, he was part of the actual diplomatic team that went before the throne of Catherine the Great in Russia. Now, as a 14-year-old, he had an actual job. What was his job? He was the official interpreter for the delegation because he was already fluent in 6 languages as a 14-year-old. It's not bad for 14, right? Give him some time. Well, as things progress in his life, when George Washington became president, George Washington chose John Quincy Adams as a diplomat. At the end of Washington's presidency, he wrote a letter where he said John Quincy Adams is the best diplomat that we have anywhere in the world. When John Adams became president, he again chose his son to be America's top diplomat. At the end of John Adams' presidency, he and Jefferson had a lot of issues at that point, and he called his son home. He's like, you're not working for the next man, right? You come home. Well, so he's not a diplomat under Thomas Jefferson, but he does become a U.S. senator during Jefferson's presidency. Then when James Madison became president, he calls John Quincy Adams out of retirement and says, I need you to be a diplomat again. He's the diplomat that actually negotiated the end of the War of 1812. Then when James Monroe became president, he became Secretary of State under James Monroe. Then he became the 6th president of the United States of America. The guy has the most impressive political resume of any president in American history, right? But after he was president, he also did something that no other president has ever done. He went from being president, he was elected to U.S. Congress. Now, that would be considered a significant demotion, right? I mean, imagine President Trump, right, President Obama being in Congress. Like, you were just like the leader of the free world. Now you're one of 435 members of Congress, or 100 in the Senate. But the reason he went back, he said there's a great evil that is yet to be remedied. He became the leader of the anti-slavery movement in Congress. He actually was given the nickname the Hellhound of Abolition because this was the single issue he cared so much about. And he was in Congress for 17 years. During his 17 years, as he's fighting against slavery, year after year after year, he was in the minority for most of his time in Congress. In fact, he said when he first got there, only about 20% of Congress was really ardent anti-slavery. He said the majority were either pro-slavery or ambivalent to the situation, right? They just, we don't really care. You guys figure it out. We're going to do other things. So he's fighting an uphill battle, and year after year after year he fights, and he's had no real significant successes. One day a reporter came to him and said, Mr. Adams, you fought for all these years, and there have been no visible signs of success. How do you stay motivated when you haven't been successful? His answer was really brilliant. His answer was based on his life motto. He wrote that his life motto was duty is ours, results are God's. He told the reporter, he said, well, that's easy. It's only up to me to do the right thing. It's up to God what happens after that. And he continued to do the right thing. His last term in Congress, and really, I mean, every 2 years in Congress, there are freshman members of Congress because every 2 years we have congressional elections. His last term in Congress, there was a young freshman that was elected. And this was the freshman's first term. And John Quincy Adams gets up and he makes all these impassioned speeches against slavery. This young freshman hears and he's like, this guy's amazing. This freshman was part of the anti-slavery movement. And at that time, the anti-slavery movement is going very strong in America. But John Quincy Adams is the political face of the movement. Well, John Quincy Adams got up one afternoon. They'd just been fighting actually about a slavery issue. And he stood up. They thought he was going to make a motion, but he clutched his chest. He fell over his desk. He had a stroke. He had a heart attack. He actually died in the Capitol building. When he died, this political face of the anti-slavery movement was now gone. And again, the movement was doing very well. But you have all of these people that have been there, and they want to carry on the movement. This young freshman says, okay, I'm going to carry on. So this freshman ran for re-election, but he got defeated. Not to be discouraged, 2 years later, he ran again. He lost the second time. He then decides, well, let me try the Senate. He ran for the Senate and got defeated. He then ran for state office and got defeated. And that freshman did not win another election until Abraham Lincoln became the president. And what's significant is, right, Lincoln's the one who did, obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation. He's the one who laid the foundation for the 13th Amendment ending slavery in America. But I want to point out, Lincoln did not come up with ideas on his own that were anti-slavery ideas. Lincoln actually had heard those speeches day after day after day, week after week, month after month. And it's interesting that John Quincy Adams fought his entire life for something he never saw realized. And he had no idea that God was using him to speak into and minister the rising generation was actually going to get the job accomplished, right? And this is something, too, that as Christians, we have to understand a transgenerational thought. That God can put a burden on our heart, on our life, for something that we feel God's called us to do. But understand sometimes your highest calling is not that you find success in that area in your lifetime. It's that you're mentoring the people that are going to carry on this movement until God accomplishes what God wants to accomplish. And as we look at this, like guys like John Quincy Adams, genuinely amazing people. There's a few people I study historically, and I'm like, I don't think this guy had any like significant major moral failings. You can find like none. Some founding fathers are like, that dude had a lot of issues, right? But other people, you're like, this guy was amazing. And if we knew more of those stories, I think it would help give us a different perspective. But see, today, if we look at the founding fathers, we talk about American history, the primary sentiments we hear are, yeah, but America's bad, right? Like the founding fathers were evil. These are prevailing sentiments we hear. And I want to remind us as a group of believers, anytime we are navigating things, the number one thing we should always do is say, okay, now what does the Bible say, right? Guidance always comes from the Word of God. Well, if we go to the Bible, how do we navigate this? Well, let me take some leaders from the Bible, for example. If we take one of the most famous leaders from the Bible, King David, arguably one of the most famous leaders from the Bible. And if you know the story of David, David was really impressive in several areas, right? We know David killed lions, we know he killed bears, and we know he did it at a young age because before he goes to kill Goliath, Saul's like, I think you're a little young, and David's like, oh, it's no problem. I used to watch my dad's sheep, lion and bear would come, I would chase them down and kill them, right? This giant will be no problem for me. Scholars think David was between 14 and 17 years old when he killed Goliath. If David was 14, that means he was chasing down and killing lions and bears when he was 10, 11, 12, 13. I've been an outdoorsman and hunter my whole life, right? Like, bear hunts, I'm down. That's awesome. But I'm taking some significant weapons with me, right? This dude had a stick and a rock, and he was a kid. David was real good at killing stuff. Let me go further. David writes the majority of the book of Psalms, right? Like David's really, really impressive. Yeah, there's a lot of good things in David's story, but the Bible doesn't stop there, right? The Bible actually tells us about some of David's kids. We learn about Amnon and Adonijah and Absalom. Now, Amnon, if you don't remember, was the one that, there's younger ears in the room. I'm going to navigate this carefully. Look up the story of Amnon, right? He's the one that forcefully knew his sister, right? And David did nothing. At that point, Absalom's like, oh, for my sister's honor, Absalom plots and plans. He kills Amnon. David does nothing. Absalom begins to think, my dad's not a very good leader. Absalom sets himself up at the city gates, begins to take attention, notoriety. He says, you know what, if I was just a leader, I'd solve all your problems. Once he becomes recognized enough, he thinks he's elevated himself enough, he leads a violent revolution against his dad, and David does nothing. He flees, right? Now, it's also worth noting at this point in the Bible narrative, we've already learned about David's mighty men, right? Like one dude by himself defended a bean patch against 1,000 men and won, right? David ain't got to run from nobody. And I can only imagine at some point David's men were like, dude, can we solve this problem? Like over the weekend, it's no big deal. Like just turn us loose. We got it. You're back on the throne. Monday, we're back. It's awesome. At some point, David turns him loose, right? And war commences. Absalom gets his hair caught in a tree. David's men use him as javelin practice, and he's done. But then it tells us that Adonijah also wanted the throne from his father. And Adonijah began to position himself, and in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, it says, Adonijah, the son whom David never corrected. The Bible says a father disciplines the son he loves, right? David was one of the worst examples of parenthood and fatherhood in the Bible. He was an absent, unloving father in the Bible. And arguably, this isn't even the worst part of King David, right? Because then we learn about a time when kings go to war and David stays back and he sees this woman of unusual beauty and he has the affair and she gets pregnant and then he has Uriah the husband bumped off. David is literally an adulterer and a murderer. Now, the first thing that's interesting about this is not just how bad David's story was, it's just interesting that the Bible unapologetically tells the whole story. It tells the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, the reason this matters is because if the only thing you know of somebody's story is bad and ugly, you might not know the whole story. On the other side, if the only thing you know about somebody is how great they were, you might not know the whole story, right? The Bible tells the whole story, but here's what becomes even more interesting for us. In our modern culture, we have a culture that says, yeah, but we can't celebrate people that have done bad things. This is cancel culture, right? As a Christian, the other believers that support this have taken the dumbest position possible as a Christian to take. Why? Because as a Christian, we're not supposed to see the world the way the world sees the world. We're not supposed to be conformed to the pattern of this world, but transformed by the renewing of our mind. What does that mean? Our starting place is what the Bible tells us very plainly. The Apostle Paul says, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. What does that mean? It means everybody is jacked up. Everybody. We all need Jesus. That's the reason he came, right? And I can tell you, as someone involved in youth ministry for 9.5 years, I was a youth director, youth pastor, and now at times have kids to me and come, and they'll be like, I can't believe so-and-so did this. I was always like, oh, I can. Like, no shock at all for me, right? Like, that's super easy. Why are we surprised as Christians when humans have fleshly moments? Like, the reason Jesus came is because there is none righteous, no, not one, is what Paul wrote in Romans. But why does this also matter? Because my understanding is shaped by this. And this is why I think also Christians have the best opportunity to understand history of anybody ever. Because we understand how it all starts. Everybody is messed up and needs a Savior. But that also means that just because someone's messed up and needs a Savior doesn't limit God's ability to use an imperfect person. If we look back, some of the most noted people in American history, understand you can't name a single American hero who wasn't jacked up. You can't. But if my starting place is, yeah, but all of us are jacked up, it doesn't prevent me from recognizing the reality of the situation. See, the reason that we have honored people historically, it's not because we thought they were perfect. Like cancel culture's like, hey, they aren't perfect, cancel them. Like, nope, I already knew that. I knew they weren't perfect from the very beginning, right? But they were never honored historically because somebody thought they were perfect. They were honored because of how God used them in spite of their imperfections. See, the reality is we celebrate how a perfect God used imperfect people and did great things through them. That's the reality. And let me give you now one Bible thought as we wrap this up. See, in Hebrews chapter 11, this is what we call our faith hall of fame. We're told without faith it is possible to please God. You have to have faith, right? And then we're told, look to heroes of the faith who have gone before us and let their lives be examples to us. So you know the examples we have in Hebrews 11? So Noah, Abraham, Moses, Rahab, Samson, David. Let me walk you through real quick. Noah, right? Unbelievable faith. It's never rained before. God's like, okay, so this thing's going to happen. Like, I need you to build this really big boat nowhere near water because I'm going to bring this rain thing's going to happen. You don't know about it. It's going to happen. Unbelievable faith. You're building the biggest boat there's ever been in a place that there's no water, and you have to deal with people persecuting, making fun. Like, that's amazing faith. Okay, given. Genesis 9, the ark lands on Mount Ararat. After the ark lands, Noah gets off. The Bible tells us that he was a farmer. He planted a vineyard. You know what it tells us in the next couple verses? He didn't just get drunk. He got drunk and passed out naked. And his sons were like, oh, Dad, what are you doing? Like, I know we're in Arkansas. Here's your joke. I don't know how your church does it. I'm just telling you, if you get drunk and pass out naked, you could not be in the leadership team in my church, right? Like, that would disqualify you. Understand. This is one of our heroes. You mean the alcoholic nudist? Yep, that guy. He's one of our heroes. Abraham, unbelievable faith, right? God says, go a direction, not even a location, go a direction. Unbelievable faith, yes. Also one of the biggest cowards and liars in the Bible. Every time he's before another official, oh, hey, I've got this pretty lady. Would you like her? It's his wife. No, I mean, she's my sister, which is also a weird Old Testament thing, but like, you can have her. I know we are gender confused in roles now. I'm just telling you. As the man, your job is to put yourself between your family and danger, not offer your family to protect yourself. That's what Abraham did. What a loser. Yeah, right? Moses was a murderer. Rahab, an actual prostitute. Samson, womanizer. David, murderer, adulterer, terrible, unloving, absent father. Those are your heroes. Now let me ask this. Why did God give us such a jacked up list of people as examples? Now we could argue it's all God had to work with. But let me go a little farther, right? Let me go a little farther. I think part of their example is to give us hope. Because if God could use them, he can use us too. Why? We are never disqualified because of our sin, and we don't have to be defined by our sin. The heroes of the faith were not defined by their sinful moments. They were defined by how God used them in spite of their sinful moments. And this is part of the reality of even understanding American history. We live in a culture that's trying to promote this false perspective that America's evil because our founding fathers weren't perfect. That's the reason Jesus came. Nobody has ever been perfect except Jesus. But God has never disqualified someone from use in his kingdom because of imperfection. That's why Jesus came. This is part of the reality of American history. It's part of the narrative of our story. Is a perfect God has used imperfect people and done incredible things in this nation. In fact, if you guys want to know more of the story, we have a website, wallbuilders.com. We have a couple of resources. There's 2 books that really tell just a ton of these kind of stories. They're footnoted, they're documented. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to tell several different stories in actually a shorter time frame. Tonight was a long service. Tomorrow, we're going to keep it more in tighter bounds. We also have a resource called the Founders Bible, where as we talk about the Bible being the primary influence of the Founding Fathers, it's historically documented to be absolutely true. 34% of all quotes documented from the founders' writings came from the Bible. And the founders actually talked about what verses impacted how they thought about, viewed, and shaped things in America. Why did they do things in the Constitution the way they did? Why did they set up things in business and education and government? Well, we actually took some of those writings and we put it by the verses they reference in their writings, so you can see it's the most important thing is it's a Bible, and that's the most important thing. You should read and know the Bible. But if you want to see how the Bible literally shaped the founding fathers and shaped this nation, it's one of the most incredible resources to see the way the Bible shaped this nation. And where I want to close and encourage us is, as we are looking at our nation, there's a lot of people who would discount faith, would discount American history, founding fathers, or even believers. But I want to tell you the reality and the hope of the gospel is that we are not disqualified because of mistakes. In fact, God is who he is because he makes a way where there seems to be no way. He uses people that the rest of the world says, got no use for you, and God says, I got a place for you, right? This is who our God is, and this is part of the story of our nation. Thank you guys for being here. Steve.